Okay, so I'll get started because it's already 2:01 p.m. Eastern. So I'll go ahead and get started. This is being recorded, so this recording will be posted after the webinar on our website, and then there's also a diagram that I'll upload. And then you should be able to reference that in the future. So the data analytics tool is a comprehensive system for creating on-the-fly filters, exports, dashboards. You can use it to create mail merges. You can use the queries to send out emails. It also has advanced database concepts like left joins, logical conditions, aliasing, aggregates, pivots, parameters, and flexible security access. In this webinar, we'll cover the basics of building the enrollment-related queries. And when I use the term enrollment, I basically mean enrollment contracts and enrollment forms. So the data that comes from enrollment contracts and enrollment forms, how do you build reports and query based on that data? So after this webinar, if you have any questions, suggestions, feedback for us, feel free to send us an email at support@pcreducator.com. And then if you have additional topics that you'd like to cover, you would like us to cover in one of the future webinars, send that to us as well. And we'll hopefully set up another webinar that goes over that information. So let's go ahead and get started with the basics. Whenever you're building any data analytics query, there are a few questions you kind of have to answer. One of the questions is, what information am I trying to get? The other question is, where is that information stored in the system? And then the third question is, when I am working in the data analytics tool, how do I access that information from the DAT? So the first question is pretty easy to answer. What information I'm looking to extract, you already know that beforehand. But the second and the third question, where is that information stored? And how do I get to that information from the data analytics tool? If you can answer those questions, it'll help you a lot when you are building your queries. So I've created a diagram that'll hopefully help you with some of these questions. And I did the same thing for the development webinar, and a lot of people love the diagram, so I figured I'd create one for this too. And let me go over some of the most common tables that you would typically use when you are building queries for enrollment contracts or enrollment forms. So the first table I have up here is student info table, and we had covered that in the previous webinar as well. Student info has the basic student information. So it has the first name, student last name, a student birth date, student grade level, nicknames, and all the other basic information that would be associated to the student. Then on the left-hand side here, we have the student options table. Student options table will be used specifically to pull the options that were selected in the contract. So when someone completes the contracts, there might be options that they have to pick from. For example, if someone is financially responsible, they may have to check that box, or if someone has to agree to certain terms and requirements, they would have to check that box. So let me pull up an example of my contract here. So I can just show you when I say student options, what do I mean by those? So a student option would be something like this. I agree to use an electronic enrollment agreement. That's something that they have to select. Or if it is required, then they have to check it. They can't just leave it unchecked. Other options are these here. It says, I agree to one of the payment options below. This would be an option. And then these payment options themselves would also be considered options. And then this lunch selection here, I wish to purchase lunch, I do not wish to purchase lunch. These are also options. So So that table, student options, would help you query these kinds of things from the database. And then when you are creating options, there are different fields in there. So for example, I have this control here called checkbox. And when I open it up, it says I hereby acknowledge, and then there's more information here. But then there's an option title that has a short version of it. The reason I'm bringing this up is that later when we build a query, there are different fields that we can pick from the data analytics tool, and one of them is the option title. So let me go back to my diagram now. So next, let's go over the student actions table and how would that be used in terms of the enrollment module. So whenever someone submits the contract or the forms, they get an action. For example, if someone submits the contract, they might get an action called contract submitted. If someone submits the form, they may get an action called form submitted. So if you're looking to query all the students that have submitted the contracts or the forms for a particular academic year, this would be the table that you would use, student actions. Also in your forms, there may be some consents that also use student actions, so that student actions would be used for that as well. And we'll cover that as we build queries in a little bit. Then there is a student attributes table. So in general, what student attributes are used for is that they are custom fields that may not already be in the database. So if there's something customized for your school that you would want to store, you will store them in student attributes. So how does it relate to the contracts and the forms? So this is mainly just related to the forms, because in the contracts you don't really use student attributes. But in the forms, you may have a question in there or a few questions in there where the answer is stored in the student attributes. For example, if you wanted to ask students if they would be interested in signing up for volunteer activities, that would be something that could be stored in student attributes. Then we have the relations table and the household and the emergency contacts and the household attributes. So I had covered that in the previous webinar. So relations table would be used to connect student to the household table, and the households table will have all the basic parent information like the address, parent name, cell phone numbers, emails, and all that. And emergency contacts would have the emergency contact information. And household attributes is just like student attributes, but is connected to household rather than to students. So for example, if you wanted to store parent license number or something, that could go into household attributes. Now let me move down here to customer invoices and when would that be used. So customer invoices would be used for contracts and not for forms. Whenever you have a contract, and in the contract, if you have fees set up like tuition fees and class fees and lunch fees and so forth, and you would like to create an invoice when the contract is submitted, that invoice will have all those fees, and then when that invoice is paid, whether it's a deposit that the family pays right away, or if it's payments that they pay in the future based on their payment term, the contract would create invoices, and that information can be queried from the invoices table. And then after the invoices, we have different tables that connect to the invoices. In most cases, you'll typically just use the customer invoice attributes table, which would let you filter invoices that came from a certain contract. For example, in your system, you may have many different, maybe thousands of invoices, but you may only have a group of invoices that came from the 1920 contract. So when invoices are generated from the contract, they get tagged with an attribute, and you can use that attribute to filter so that you only see the invoices that came from a certain contract. So if you wanted to just find 1920 invoices that came from the 1920 contract, you can use customer invoice attributes to filter on that. Because if you do not do that, it will show you all the invoices from previous years and from lunch and many other parts of the system. Then customer invoice items, it would show you the individual line item on an invoice. So if you have one invoice that has different fees, like if you have a tuition fee, if you have a class fee, technology fee, and so forth, the customer invoice table will give you like an overall summary, like the total amount, whereas the invoice items will break it down for you into each line item. And then that connects to the products. Products would tell you what was specifically purchased. So a product may be tuition, a product may be technology fee, and so forth. So we'll be looking at that as we build queries as well. The other parts like customer invoice receipts, you won't use that too often. So the customer invoice receipts connect invoices to the customer receipts table. And the customer receipts table, what that is used for is to get more information about the receipt. So if someone goes in and they pay for the deposit and they pay via e-check or via credit card, that information would be stored in the customer receipts table because it'll show you what form of payment that they made, whether it's credit card, e-check, check, or anything else. And customer invoice schedule, this is used to break down the full schedule of your invoice. So if someone signs up for a 10-monthly plan, if you were to include the customer invoice schedule table into your query, then it'll break down each invoice in terms of when it is due. So if you have a 10-payment plan, then it'll show you that how much of the invoice is due each month of those 10 months. So these are all the primary tables that you may be using. In some queries, you may just use student options. In other queries, you may use customer invoices. And in some queries, you may use attributes or family information. So this would be a good way to kind of figure out how to get to certain information from the data analytics tool. So let's get started by building our first query. So in this first query, what I want to do is I would like to find all the options that were selected from the contract. So as I was going through it earlier, I want to, for example, know who's checked off the I'm financially responsible checkbox. And then I have other boxes, and I'd like to know who checked off what box and who selected what options in my contract. So let me go ahead and get started with the data analytics tool, the DAT. And I'll create a new query here by clicking New. And then as I was looking at this diagram, the first table that I would typically start off with is the student info. And student info would be under the students category, and I can just grab the student info table. So this is where I can get my basic information: student ID, student first name, last name, grade level, birth date, and anything else that I may want. I can just grab that information from here, and I can save this report. I typically, whenever I add a table and fields, I typically just click results to make sure that my report works. So here I can see the student ID, the first name, the last name, the grade level. So it looks like it's working so far. So now I want to get the options for my contract. So I'd like to know what options were selected. So then I pull up my diagram, and it tells me that student options table is connected directly to the student info table. So I'll click the plus sign on the left hand here. And then in this second drop down, I can see all the possible tables that get connected to the student info table. So the one that I'm looking for is student options. And when I pick the student options, I see different fields here, and one of them is called option title, which is what I was showing you earlier. So option title would give me like a quick summary of what the option is. So I can select option title. You could also try description. Description would give you the entire text, so it might be a bit too much for you to see in your query. So I just like to use the title because that's a short summary of it. And then there's a field here called option selected. This tells me whether they selected that option or not. So I'm going to go ahead and pick option title, option selected, and click save. And then I'll go ahead and click results. So here I have two students that I had submitted the contract for beforehand, and it tells me each option and whether that option was selected or not. So if it's 0, it means that the option was not selected. And if it is 1, that means that this option was selected. So for example, Jasmine Delavegi's family, they want to donate an annual giving monthly donation of $1,000 because they selected that option. And when I look at Greg's family, they want to donate annual giving gift of $25. Because it says 1, I know that they selected that option, whereas these other options are 0. That means that they did not select those options. Now, I'd like to only find options that were selected. So I don't care about all these options that were not selected. Let's say that I only care about the options that were selected. What I can do is I can go to my query and I can open up my student options table and I can simply say option selected equals 1. I can click add and I can save it. And let me also organize my report a little bit. So if I go to column order, I'll say student last name, student first name, grade level, option title, option selected, and then I'll move student ID somewhere here. Okay. So now I have student information, then I have my option title and whether it was, and then only the ones that were selected. If you'll notice that there are a couple of blank fields here, so this would happen if you, in your contract, if you had controls that did not have an option title, that it would show a blank field. So if you don't have an option title and you don't want to see a blank field like this, you can also go to query and you can say something like option title greater than equal to whichever is at the top of your list. And then if I click results, now I don't see those blank lines. So this tells me that these are my two students and what options that they have selected, whether it's I agree that I'm financially responsible. This one says I do not wish to make a donation. This one says I wish to participate in TRP and so forth. And the reason that it says I do not wish to make a donation here, but then it says annual giving monthly is because of how my contract is set up. So if I pull it up for a second, I have two ways of making donations. So one is for one-time giving and the other one is for monthly giving. So this family selected I do not wish for one-time gift, but they selected $1,000 for monthly giving. That's why it shows both of those options. So this would be a very quick way to create a query that tells you the students and then what options they selected. And of course, you can put conditions on individual options. So if you just wanted to know who signed up, or if you only wanted to know which of the families are marked as financially responsible, you can just select this option from the query itself. So when you are here, you can just go to option title, and you can pick whichever option you would like. So if it says, I agree that I'm financially responsible, or let's say that you wanted to find people that wish to sign up for to participate in the TRP, you can put that as a condition, and you can set it equal to 1. And then if you go to your results, it'll show you only those people that selected to participate in TRP. So you can play around with that and get the information that you need. But the basic idea is that the options that are selected in the contract, you can use the student options table to get that information. The other thing that you would want to add is that when you select student info and student options, it'll show you options for all of your contracts from previous years. So if you click the plus sign on student options, there's a table called contract controls. And the reason that you may want to use that table is because you can add a condition of academic year so that it only pulls data for the academic year that you would like. So if I go back to my diagram, it connects student options to contract controls, and the contract controls can just be used to filter out only options that are for your most active or most recent contract. So the way that you do it is you can say academic year equals, and you can say 1920 or whichever academic year you're looking for. Or an easier way would be so that your query gets updated each year automatically. What you can do is you can come here, and there's an option that says academic year admissions, and you can pick current year. So what happens is that if your academic year is 18-19 year, your admissions year is typically 1 year forward. So if my academic year is 18-19, my admissions year would typically be 19-20. So when I say academic year admissions current, that means that the current admissions year is 19-20. This way, next year when I run the same query, it'll show me for 2021 year, so I don't have to keep updating my query each year because it'll automatically get updated each year. So when you put an academic year condition, this won't affect my query because I've only set this up for the 19-20 year. But if you have several years worth of contracts, I would recommend doing this so that it only pulls the most recent contract information. Now let me move on to the next query. So in this next query, what I'll do is I'll create a query that shows me students that have submitted their contracts. And I'll also add an academic year so we can see how many students have submitted a contract for each year. So let me go ahead and just start with the new query. And I'll start with the student info table like I did before. And I'll get the student first name, last name, and save it. And then from here, as I have said before, whenever a contract gets submitted, it gets stored in a student actions table. So if I pull up my diagram, I can see that student info gets connected to student actions table. So I can come here and then I can connect student info to a student actions table here. And then I can put a condition to find the action contract submitted, because when someone submits a contract in my setup, they get the contract submitted action. If you're not sure what action they get when they submit the contract, you can just go to your contract settings. So if you go to your contract settings here, this field here will tell you what action your contract is using. So it may not be exactly the same as mine, but this would be a way to figure out what action to use. So I'm going to go ahead and put a condition called contract submitted, and I'll make the action description visible so I can see that this is for contract submitted. And then I'll also make the academic year visible. And let me run what I have so far. So this tells me the name of each student and what years they have submitted the contract. So this student submitted the contract in 15-16 year, 16-17, 17-18, and 18-19. But I don't like the way that it looks. What I want is I want the totals of how many contracts were submitted each year. So I want to compare how many contracts were submitted let's say in 15, 16, and 16, 17, 17, 18, and so forth, and kind of get a good representation to see how many contracts I'm getting each year. So because I only care about, I just care about the totals based on the academic year and the action itself, I don't really need to show the student information, because every student that is in the system, it'll show a separate row for each individual contract submitted action. So what I can do is I can go to my query and I can hide the fields that I don't really care about right now. Right now, I just care about the action description and I care about the academic year. And then I'll go to my fields. And then at the top here, there's an option in the dropdown that says unique rows with count. So I'll select that. And then I can use an alias to change this to a total. And then I can organize it. So maybe I want to sort it by the academic year and then the action, but the action is the same, so it shouldn't matter. So now when I run my query, it tells me that for each academic year, how many contracts were submitted. So for 10, 11, 31 were submitted, and 11, 12, 33, and so forth. And I can kind of see a trend that more recently I've had over 40 contracts, but last year I had less than what I had in the couple years before that. So this is a way for you to kind of see totals of your numbers. And then let me go ahead and save this for a second. I'll call it Enrollment Webinar Totals. So nice thing about this is that when you are using counts in your reports, you'll notice that the chart tab is enabled. And when you're looking at the chart, you can say something like, if you want to actually use the x-axis for action description and you want to group it by academic year, you can do something like this and it'll give you a visual representation of how many contracts were submitted each year. So, and then on the right-hand side, it has the legend here that this blue is 1920, this pink is 1819, and so forth. In my experience, I've found that when I'm doing totals, the column and the bar, these two charts work the best. So if I make this academic year, you can see now it's going left to right, and then it has the numbers here, and then it has the legend on the right-hand side. So anytime that you would like to test out charts and build charts, you just have to make sure that you're doing a count on them, on your data, so that when you are building charts, it'll look at that count and it'll build it appropriately. And then you can pick how you would like to group your data by. So I'm grouping it by academic year. That's why it shows these academic years on the right-hand side. And then if you notice, if I hover over it highlights it on the chart as well. So this is the second query that I wanted to show you. Now let's move on to the next query. So the next one that I'd like to go over is, it would have to be, so the next query that I'd like to go over goes over invoices. So as I was saying earlier, whenever someone submits a contract, if you have products and if you have payment terms all set up properly, the contract will generate invoices, either one invoice or two invoices, depending on if you're splitting the deposit into a separate invoice or not. So the customer invoices table will give you the basic information of what the total amount of the invoice was for the contract, what the next due amount is, whether the invoice is paid or not, and so forth. So let's go ahead and build a query that shows us student information, and it shows us the invoices that came from the 1920 contract, which, as I was saying, we'll use customer invoice attributes to do a filter on that. So I'll go back to my DAT, and then I'll click New, and I'll start again with my student info table. and I'll pick the basic information. So I'll get student ID, first name, last name, maybe the grade level, and click Save. Next, if I want to get to the customer invoice table, it tells me that student info directly gets connected to the customer invoices table. So I'm going to go ahead and connect this. So customer invoices table, I'll connect this here. And then you can see that there are many different options here. So I have the total here, I have the payment term, I have the issue date, I have the due date, due amount. So this would be like the next due date and the next due amount. And many other fields that I could get from this, but I'll just pick these for now. And I'll actually also pick is paid off, and I'll pick paid amount as well. And then I'll save it. And let me run my report here. So as I expected, it shows me over 900 invoices. And let me add one other field to this. So I'm also going to add customer memo, as that describes it gives a basic description of the invoice. So I'm going to go ahead and pick customer memo, and I'll save it, and I'll click results. So in this query, you can see that not only do I have contract invoices, and the contract invoices are in this 985 rows, but there are many other invoices that I may not care about for this query. For example, I have something for the school store, I have field trips, I have bus service, and I have summer camps and so forth. So as I was saying earlier, when you just add the customer invoices information to student info, it'll show you all the invoices. But if we want to restrict it to the contract invoices only, that's when we connect the customer invoices table to the customer invoice attributes table. So let me go ahead and do that next. So I'll go ahead and click the plus on the customer invoices table, and I should be able to pick customer invoice attributes. And then I can put a condition here that says that I want the attribute to be contract 1920. And I'll click add. So now when I click save here and click on results, I think I added this twice. Let me get rid of this here. So now I only get the invoices from the contracts that have been submitted for the 1920 year. So it restricts it just to those invoices. So that's the reason that we would want to use the customer invoice attributes table and put a condition on that table so that it only pulls attribute for the year that you're looking for. Now, let me organize this a little bit because it's kind of all over the place. So let me organize it by going to column order. And I'll bring in the student last name and move that up. And then I'll move the student first name, grade level, student ID. And then I'll bring the total amount. I'll bring the customer memo. Then the due date, due amount, whether it's paid off. I'll bring the issue date here, payment term, and is paid off, paid amount, and payment term. And then I'll go to my fields and I'll change the display format for my amount to be in this format with the $, and the date to be in this format so that I don't see the timestamp on it. And I'll do the same thing to the other fields that are applicable. And save it. And let me click results. So now I can see that the dates have been formatted, the amounts have been formatted, and it's in the order that I had specified in the column order. So I can see that Jasmine has 2 invoices and Greg has 2 invoices. one is already paid off for both of them, and the other one is not yet paid off. And the first one, the payment term is net due, which means that it's paid off right away. And the second one for Jasmine has 2 payment terms, and the second one for Greg has 10 payment terms. The reason that the contract created 2 invoices is because I've separated the deposit invoice into its own invoice. And because the deposit is paid off at this time that the contract is submitted, you can see that the deposit invoice is paid off, is marked as paid off, whereas the second invoice is not yet paid off. Now what I want to see is that this gives me information about my invoice, but it doesn't tell me what that invoice contains, like what was actually purchased. Was it tuition? Was it class fees? Was it anything else on top of those 2 things? So if I want to get the line items of each invoice, there's a table called Customer Invoice Items here. So that also connects directly to customer invoices. So I'm going to grab this table next. So I'll go to Query. And I know that customer invoice items connects to customer invoices, just like how customer invoice attributes connects to customer invoices. So I'm going to go ahead and click the plus sign here. And I'll select the customer invoice items table. And then here there are a few different fields. So quantity times price would be your overall price. And then quantity, I mean, you can pick something, but typically when everything comes from the contract, the quantity is 1 anyway, so it shouldn't really matter. So I'm just going to pick quantity times price. And then I'll go in and format this field to show a $sign as well. And then the other thing I want to do is that each of the line item has a product associated with it. So whenever you have an invoice, you have different line items, and then within that line item, you have a product associated with it. So in addition to the price, I also want to know the name of the product so that I know what they purchased. And the name of the product would be coming through the products table, which is connected to the customer invoice items table. So I'm going to go ahead and save this, and then I'll click plus on the customer invoice items, and then I'll select the products table. And then from here, I can get the name of the product name, and click save. And then if I click results, now I actually see information as to what was purchased in each invoice. So for Jasmine, they have a 5 to 6 tuition product. She also received a financial aid of $105 from the deposit. So the deposit was 2450, and then she received a discount of $105 from the deposit. And then from the rest of the invoice, she received a financial aid of $945. And then these line items tell you what each item was purchased and how much each item cost. So Jasmine had BSPA fee, class fee, technology fee, lunch, and morning bus fee. And then Greg had all of these other fees here. So customer invoice items, when connected with the products table, gives you more details about each invoice. So there might be cases where you want to see individual line items, but there might be cases where you just want to see the overall invoice amount. So depending on what you're trying to query, you could use a combination of these tables. So let's move on to the next query. So the next query that I'll look at is the query to find all the students that have submitted forms. And as I was saying before, whenever contracts or forms are submitted, a student receive a student action. So an action may be called form submitted or contract submitted or so forth. So if you're not sure what action a student gets when they submit the forms, you can go to settings of your contract, and then there would be a form submitted field, and it'll tell you what action is given when the forms are submitted. So in my example, the action is form submission. So that's what I'll be searching for when I build my query. So let's get started. It says that I'm supposed to start with student info and then connect this to student actions. And then on student actions, I can put a condition to get forms submitted. So I'll go ahead and do that now. So I'll go to DAT. I'll start a new query. I'll open up my students table, student info, and then I'll pick the basic fields like I do. And you don't have to start a query as a new query each time. If you have a similar report that you have built, you can just edit that. I'm just building new ones every time to kind of go over the process again. But you can take any existing query that has some of the same tables, and you can build on it and then save it as a new query. And I did an example of that in my last webinar. So I'm building everything from scratch, but you'll save a lot of time if you just take something that's similar to it and make updates to it. So I'll pick some of the basic student information fields and I'll save it. And then I'll go ahead and click the plus sign, and I'll get the student actions table. And I was saying earlier, in my case, the action is called form submission. So I'll pick that. And then in the academic year, I'll go ahead and do the same thing that I did earlier. So I'll say academic year admissions and then current year, so that I don't have to update this every time. And then I can click either action. I can make my action description visible and just save it. And then let me go ahead and run my query. So it tells me that these are all the students that have the form submitted action in the 1920 year. I can go and make other fields visible, like the action date. I can make this visible. So I've made the action date visible, and I made the academic year visible as well. So this would be a way for you to quickly find students that have submitted the forms by using the form submitted or form submitted action. And so I have 30 people that have submitted the form in the 1920 year. Now, let's say that I want to add more stuff to this. Let's say that I want to find out if out of these students, which students have permission for us to post their photo on our website. Because I had asked that question in my forms, I should be able to query for all the students that are allowed to have their photos published. So let me go ahead and hide a couple of the fields that I don't think I'll need for right now. So I'll hide academic year and action date first. And I'll just leave the action description visible. So these are my 30 students. They have submitted the form. Now, if I want to find out of these who can I put on my website, I'll go to my forms. And in my forms, I have a section in here. So if I go inside of my forms, I have a section in here that says permission forms. And in this permission form, I have a checkbox that says I give permission for my child's image to be used under these terms, so to be posted on the website. So how do I know where this information is stored in the database? And once I know that, how do I query for it from my data analytics tool? So to find out where that information is stored, you go to controls at the top and you go to the appropriate sections of permission forms and then student photographs. And then this is the question. It says I give my permission for my child's image. So if I open it up, actually, this is the press. This is a press release. There's another one up here. This is the one for the website. So this control tells me that if they check that box, they'll get an action called photograph website release -Y. Now I know where this information is stored. It's stored under this action, photograph website release -Y. In some cases, you might be storing information in attributes. In other cases, they might be in actions. So depending on where that information is stored, you would pull that from that table from your in your data analytics query. Now that I know where this is stored, I'm going to go back to my query. And because it's stored in student actions, I'm going to go ahead and connect student info again to student actions. And I'm going to select, instead of with, I'm going to select with or without. So the reason is, if I select with, and I'll show you what the difference is. So if I select with, and then I put in an action description of photograph website release yes, and click add, and make this action description, and then click results. This shows me 25 students because out of those 30 people, out of those 30 students, only 25 have set this as yes. But what I want for myself is I want to see all of the students, but out of those all students, if they have a permission to be published on the website, then I wanted to show it. If they don't, I still want to show the student name, but I just want that particular field to be blank. So if I, instead of with, if I select with or without and save it, if they did not select that option, then it'll just be blank. And if they did select the option, then it'll show me the description here. So you can see now I have 30 again, and then I can see that these are the students that have selected the option, and the ones that are blank have not selected that option in my forms. Why did I create a separate table instead of just connecting it to this table? Because I wanted it to have a separate column. If I put everything in one table, then it will show me multiple rows for each student. So it will show me 2 rows for this first student and 2 rows for the second student, because everything would be put in one column. So that's one of the reasons that I connected the student info the second time to the student actions table. That's one reason for it. And the second reason is so that I could put a with or without condition so that I could see all my 30 students. And out of those 30 students, I could see which ones have given permission to release their photograph. So that was an example using student actions. But now let's say that something is stored in attributes and not in actions. For example, let me go back to my forms. And in my forms, I have a question, or not even a question. So if I go to student information, I have this drop down here that says interested in volunteer activities, yes or no. Let's say that I want to find, out of those 30 students, I want to know how many students are interested in volunteer activities. So again, first I have to figure out where this data is stored. So I go to my controls, and then I go to the appropriate page. And then from the page it says interested in volunteer activities. So I open up this control. And then it tells me that so when I look at the control itself, it tells me that it's an attribute control. And when I pull it up, it tells me that it's stored in student attributes. And the name of the attribute is called interested in volunteer activities. And what you see in front of it, MISC, that's the category of the attribute. But the name is actually interested in volunteer activities. So I have my second question answered, which is where is this data stored? Now I just need to figure out how do I add that table to my query, and I should be able to get the information that I need. So if I come back to my diagram, it tells me that student attributes gets connected directly to the student info table. So now I have my third question answered, which is, where do I get this information in the data analytics tool? So let me go back here, and I'll connect student info to student attributes table, and then I'll put a condition and say interested in volunteer activities, and I'll click add, and I'll make the description visible. And I didn't do this for the actions, but you can do the same thing for the actions and the attribute. You can use the attribute year so that you only pick the 1920 or whichever your current forms are, so that you don't pick what they selected last year. So I can put that condition here, and then I'll say with or without, and then I'll go ahead and click results. So now this tells me these are the students, and it tells me whether they are interested in volunteer activities or not, and then whether their information can be published on the website. And if it's blank, that means they're not interested in volunteer activities. And if it's blank here, that means that they don't want their photo to be published. And if I scroll down, I get the 30 number. So it gives me all of my students, and it gives me the information that I'm looking for. Now, if I want to make this look a little bit better, I don't like the fact that it just shows the action description for all the rows where they have it, and then blank for everything that it doesn't have. So there are a couple of things that I can do. If I go to my fields, I can rename, so I have action description for my form submission, then I have action description for my photo release, and then I have attribute description here. So I can rename these to be, so I can say something like forms submitted, then I can say photo publish on website. So I'm renaming those columns. And then in the third one, I can say interested in volunteer activities. And if I save this, and if I come here, now it'll relabel the columns to what I wanted, but I still don't like the fact that it shows the name every single time here. So if I go back to my fields, and if I use the aggregate and change this to count for all three of them and save it and run, now it just puts a 1 if they have the permission, and it puts a 0 if they're not interested, or if they did not give a permission for something. So you'll notice that all of them have 1 for form submitted because they have all submitted the forms, but some of them want their photos published, and some of them are interested in volunteer activities. So you can do something like this to build more complex queries that has more information, like different consents and different attributes and what permissions that someone may have given for their child. So you can use the same concept to build more complicated queries. So this is all I had for today's webinar. I covered a few queries, and I've recorded this, so I'll post this after the webinar. And like always, if you have any suggestions, feedback, or any topics that you'd like me to cover in one of the future webinars, just send us an email to support@pcreducator.com, and we'll be sure to cover that. And I just want to thank you for joining me for this webinar. I hope it was helpful, and based on your feedback, I'll try to make these webinars even better in the future. I'll post the diagram and the recording shortly on our website, and I'll post it on our homepage of campus. So I want to thank you all again for joining me, and hopefully this was helpful for you today. Thank you. Have a great day. Bye.